Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're stepping right into the high-stakes boardroom of corporate finance to unpack Chapter 7, which is all about correspondence with debenture holders. We're going to look at exactly how a company manages its absolute most critical financial relationships. And spoiler alert, we're not talking about the owners here, we're talking about their most powerful lenders. It's this incredibly delicate balancing act of law, big money, and corporate diplomacy.
Okay, let's just dive right into this. You know, when you see those towering skyscrapers, massive corporate expansions, or just dizzying stock charts, you're really looking at the results of astronomical amounts of capital. But here's the thing. Companies don't just use their own cash to build these empires. They borrow it. And when a corporation needs to borrow, say, hundreds of millions of dollars, they don't just stroll into a local bank branch. No, they issue what are known as debentures. The folks who buy these debentures, well, they hold a tremendous amount of power over the company. So managing that high-stress relationship is absolutely crucial to a corporation's very survival.
To really understand how this whole dynamic works, here's our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 1. Understanding debentures. 2. The Secretary's vital role. 3. Issuing allotment letters. 4. Managing interest payments. And finally, 5. Conversion and redemption.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Understanding Debentures. What exactly are the stakes of this financial relationship?
So, fundamentally, a debenture is just a formal, legal admission that a company owes someone money. It's an instrument issued under the company's official common seal, acting as undeniable, concrete evidence of a debt. You can think of it like the ultimate ironclad corporate IOU. When a company issues a debenture, they're literally making a legally binding promise that they owe a very specific sum of money to the holder of that document. It's long-term debt, and it carries an absolute assurance of repayment on a specific due date. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Now, it's actually incredibly easy to confuse lenders with owners. So the crucial point we need to get straight is the difference between a debenture holder and a shareholder. Shareholders are the actual owners of the company, right? They get voting rights and a variable slice of the profits, which we call dividends. Debenture holders, on the flip side, are strictly creditors. Because they are the ones lending the company money, they get a guaranteed, fixed interest rate. They also get priority in repayment. Meaning, if the company goes under, debenture holders get their money back way before the shareholders ever see a single dime. But here's the catch. In exchange for all that financial security, they get absolutely zero voting rights. They do not get to run the company. Simply put, if you want control, you buy shares. If you want safety, you buy debentures.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Secretary's vital role. If debenture holders can't vote, how on earth does the company interact with them?
Well, ask yourself this. If you personally lent a major corporation a massive chunk of your hard-earned money, how exactly would you expect them to treat you? You'd expect them to be communicative, highly respectful, and incredibly professional, right? I mean, you literally hold their debt. And that is exactly the mindset the company's secretary must adopt. They step up as the primary point of contact between the corporate management and these incredibly powerful creditors.
Because of this really intense power dynamic, the secretary has to exercise extreme caution and use a very specific set of skills when corresponding with debenture holders. The tone always has to be polite and courteous. You have to give due respect to the creditors. Got a query or a complaint? That needs a prompt response to avoid any mounting frustration. Furthermore, as a confidential officer, the secretary is legally bound to maintain complete secrecy regarding undisclosed corporate info, to prevent unfair advantages like insider trading. Ultimately, the whole goal of this communication is to maintain the goodwill and positive image of the company. A PR disaster with your major creditors is practically a fast track to corporate ruin.
And the thing is, all those soft skills, the politeness, the promptness, they're actually backed by hard law. The secretary isn't just being nice for the sake of it. Every single letter, every notice, and every payment must strictly comply with statutory provisions. Specifically, we're talking about the Companies Act of 2013, which is basically the ultimate rule book they are bound to. So mistaken correspondence isn't just bad manners here, it can actually be a very serious legal violation.
All right, moving on to Section 3, Issuing Allotment Letters. Now that we know who's managing the relationship, let's trace the actual chronological life cycle of a debenture, starting with the very first handshake.
So, when an investor applies to buy debentures and the company's board of directors approves it, the clock immediately starts ticking. The company has a strict, legally mandated window of exactly 6 months from the date of allotment to issue the official, finalized debenture certificate. But obviously, the investor can't just wait around in the dark for half a year wondering where their millions went, right?
And that is exactly why the very first piece of crucial correspondence the Secretary sends out is the letter of allotment. This letter steps in to inform the applicant that yes, their money has been accepted and the debentures have indeed been allotted to them. It acts as a vital temporary placeholder. The Secretary has to clearly instruct the debenture holder to preserve this letter carefully, because down the line, they'll literally have to hand it back in physical exchange for their official debenture certificate.
Next up is Section 4, Managing Interest Payments. Once those debentures are allotted, we enter the longest and, frankly, the most important ongoing phase of this corporate diplomacy.
Now, I want to read a quote directly from our source material here because it forms the absolute bedrock of how debentures work. Here it is. Payment of interest is a fixed liability of the company, irrespective of the fact whether the company makes profit or not. Let that really sink in for a second. Shareholders, they only get dividends if the company has a genuinely good year. But a debenture holder gets their fixed rate of interest no matter what happens. The Secretary absolutely must ensure this payment happens precisely on schedule every single time. No excuses.
So how does that payment actually happen in the real world? Well, the Secretary generally uses one of two methods. The traditional method is the interest warrant. This is a physical document mailed right to the debenture holder, kind of like a check. It comes with a letter detailing exactly how many debentures they hold, the gross interest amount, the tax deducted at source, which we call TDS, that's the tax withheld for the government, and then finally, the net amount. Then there's the modern method, which, as you might guess, is much more common today, electronic payment. Here, the Secretary just sends a letter confirming that the money has been directly transferred into the creditor's bank account via systems like ECS or NEFT. But in both cases, clear, accurate, and prompt communication of these financial details is absolutely paramount.
Finally, let's move to Section 5, Conversion and Redemption. Let's see how all of this builds to the final phase of the debenture life cycle, where the relationship either transforms or just closes out entirely.
See, some debentures are what we call convertible debentures. And this is a super fascinating financial mechanism where after a specified period, the creditor actually transforms into an owner. But because this process dilutes the current ownership, the company first has to hold an extraordinary general meeting, or EGM. That's a special meeting outside the normal schedule used just to pass a special resolution getting shareholder approval. Once that's approved, the Secretary sends a letter of option to the debenture holders. If they choose to proceed, the final step is a letter confirming that their debt has magically transformed into equity shares, usually at a rate lower than the current market value. Boom! The creditor is now a voting shareholder.
But what about non-convertible debentures? For those, we have redemption. This is the final act of the play. On the specific maturity date written on that original debenture certificate, the company has to repay the entire borrowed principal amount. The Secretary sends a letter of redemption, which coordinates the return of the certificate and that final massive payout. And once the money is transferred, the debt is cleared, the dust settles, and the Secretary's role as the custodian of this specific borrowed capital is officially complete.
It is such an intricate, highly regulated dance of diplomacy and finance, so I want to leave you with this somewhat provocative thought to ponder. When a company owes millions upon millions of dollars tied to strict legal contracts and fixed liabilities, who really holds the true power in the boardroom? Is it the shareholders who ostensibly own and run the business, or is it the debenture holders, the quiet creditors who legally must be paid back no matter what? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.